Good evening, Synod. A notice, there are 15 cars between west and south outside James, and these are at risk of parking violations. So you're either not hanging your thingy-majig right, or you're parked where you shouldn't be parked. If you think that that is you, please speak to the information desk downstairs. Thank you. We come now to item 28. Members will need GS 2315. You will also need notice paper 4, which gives the financial memo, as this item has a financial impact. You will also need order paper 8, which has the motion and the amendments. I now call on Flora Winfield to move her motion. Speak to and move the motion. You have up to 10 minutes.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. It's late in the day and in these sessions, and there have been deep, serious, and challenging conversations about matters which are critical to the life and future flourishing of the Church. We have heard much about trust and transparency, accountability, reducing complexity, increasing agency, and making our collective life easier to understand and to navigate. We have heard in these days how complicated processes can encourage mistrust and erode respect, and how easily process becomes something that creates barriers and makes relationship harder, and the impact that can have on fragile places. And I was struck by all these things because these themes have been at the heart of our work in the review of the mission and pastoral measure. The measure provides a legal framework which enables mission and the cure of souls, supporting worship, mission and ministry, and enabling the Church to adapt that provision as circumstances change over time. The measure sets out the ways to change and consult on pastoral and ministry arrangements, and to prepare buildings for their future ministry. And what you have before you tonight in our draft document is at least the 40th draft, that's 40, in 9 months of these proposals. And perhaps that gives some understanding of the listening and attention we have tried to bring to discover, understand, and express consensus around this work. That listening was important because of the issues I have just mentioned. We have travelled from Exeter to Carlisle, from rural churches through former industrial heartlands, seeing the measure in action. We have visited BMOs in city centres and rural areas. We have visited parishes who have experienced reorganisation and heard their stories. We have visited deaneries who are finding ways to address challenges together, and met with archdeacons and bishops and patrons and members of diocesan mission and pastoral committees in wide and rich conversations. All these people gave their time and their wisdom with generosity and grace, and we are so grateful. The overwhelming message we heard in all these conversations was that how this work is done matters as much, or sometimes more than, what is done, and that trust was a key issue. So, we are proposing a new, spacious legal architecture which will provide the best conditions for a proper mission and pastoral environment for conversations and consultation, even when those conversations are really difficult, and that will take into account room for future growth and development. We also recognise in our travels the reality of fragile places and the need for something like a fallow time emerged. This is not a fully developed idea at this point, and we welcome Synod's wisdom on how you would like to see these ideas progress further as we work through the legal and financial details. In the proposals, we emphasise the importance of being able to talk earlier and in a more open and collaborative way about pastoral arrangements, ministry matters, and the future of buildings, enabling ideas and innovation to emerge from all parts of the church, and to give people a sense of agency, that they can use the new measure in a way that will help them fulfill their mission. 3 years ago, the Church Commissioners were asked to review the measure by the Archbishop's Council. In July 2021, the Synod supported the initial ideas and voted overwhelmingly for this work to continue. A summary of the massive response to the public consultation which followed was then presented to Synod in February 2022. In those responses, we heard many important things, but particularly that more listening was needed before the proposals were developed further. In February 2022, we established our General Synod reference group so that members of Synod themselves could contribute directly to the proposals. The members of the group are listed at the back of our report, and I want to pay particular tribute to them this evening, as they have shown such commitment and care to this work, as we have identified together the consensus for where change was needed and what that change could look like. These were candid conversations, and not everyone will agree with everything we have set out. But it was important that we modelled an approach that was focused on listening together, and on finding the consensus in a way that was respectful and considerate. The Mission and Pastoral Measure is a legislative framework which has its roots in the 19th century and which was designed in the very different context of the 1960s and which has not changed substantially since, although it has been consolidated and amended. We agreed it needed to be updated and used the consultation responses directly to guide our work. For example, you asked for a measure that would be simpler and easier to understand, with processes which would enable the building of trust and more collaborative relationships. We have proposed this legislative change, shaped around a new measure with more accessible and much simpler statutory guidance, and a new legal architecture which will encourage a cultural shift to build greater trust through transparency and accountability. You asked for a way of doing strategic thinking together. We have proposed the introduction of mission and pastoral diocesan frameworks, which would articulate your shared understanding of how the mission and pastoral measure functions would be delivered in your diocese. You asked for a more collaborative approach and greater agency for parishes. We have proposed changes which encourage a co-design, co-production approach, which is genuinely inclusive. You asked for more attention to be paid to clergy well-being. And we agree that the mission and pastoral process and decision-making needs to take much more account of the impact of proposals on clergy and volunteers. You asked for a focus on the needs, traditions, and characteristics of the parish to remain, and we have kept that focus. You wanted to ensure that the protection of the life of parishes and church buildings was a commitment. And we have said that structural changes in these areas would still require legal schemes and retain the right to appeal to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. You were concerned about long suspensions of presentation. I think the Church of England record is 42 years, but if anyone has more in their diocese, I'd love to know. We have proposed a fixed term limit for suspension and a new terminology of pause rather than suspend, and are pleased that the House of Bishops supported these proposals. You wanted to see a greater recognition of the issues parishes and dioceses face together, a realism about that. We have developed the fallow time idea and will explore possible legal, administrative and financial changes which might help those parishes who are fragile and in need of time for regenerative recuperation, as we all will be after this set of sessions. It is important to say that in our conversations we gave careful thought to finding the balance between the need for the Church to be more nimble and agile in its decision-making so that we can address our shared challenges together. We are conscious that in some areas there is more work to be done to finalise the shape of our recommendations and establish consensus. And we need to work together to support the cultural change for conversations under the new measure, not just in terms of the process, but for the experience of all those involved. I beg to move the motion, standing in my name.
Item 28, review of the mission and pastoral measure, is now open for debate. The speech limit will be 25. You can have 25 minutes. The speech limit will be 5 minutes. I think he's standing, yeah. I would like to call Mark Wallace for a maiden speech, and Rick Thorpe also for a maiden speech.
Mark Wallace, Chelmsford 86. Chair, thank you, and I'm busy cutting 22 minutes out of this text. Before I begin, though, I do need to declare an interest as a CPS patronage trustee. I do thank the MPCPC for their work on GS 2315, and especially for the fringe meeting they hosted on Saturday evening. That meeting was a helpful opportunity to explore informally some of the nuances of the report, and the Third Church Estates Commissioner and her team helpfully clarified a number of areas of concern. Thank you. To be clear, I support the motion, and I urge Synod to do so as well. I'm particularly pleased to see the proposal that the often misunderstood terminology of parishes being suspended is replaced by the more neutral language of pause. Being suspended has always sounded rather punitive, whereas being paused sounds rather more hopeful and, to be frank, a little less painful as well. But I would here like to address the section on changes to patronage in the report. And if you're still conscious at this time of night, I'm referring to pages 57 and 58 in the document. Now, I am aware that for many in this synod, patronage will be a bit of a pain in the neck. Patrons tend to insist on due process. They usually take the long view, thinking in terms of decades, not months. Patronage is also independent to the diocese and parish, and that can be a frustration to those who want to push things through. Perhaps even now the snipers in the gantry are getting into position, I don't know. But we're all aware that we serve at a time when concerns are being raised about power and how it is used. And sadly, this is often the case around the appointment of clergy into parishes. Might I therefore encourage Synod members to be cautious of any attempt to reduce the historic and legal power of patrons? Making things easier is not always making things better. The patronage system has acted as a check and a balance on the use of power in parish appointments, as patrons can bring experience, expertise, and, yes, independence to the process. Now, I'm well aware, of course, of cases where patrons have failed to engage appropriately. To that end, as we talked on Saturday evening, I would invite the MPCPC to consider a use it or lose it approach, which, with safeguards, might help break any deadlocks. But I'm grateful to Flora and to her team for agreeing to engage with patrons in the ongoing process of refining all of this, and I hope we can explore these issues fruitfully together in the very near future. Thank you.
Bishop Rick Thorpe, followed by Mr. James Pitkin on Zoom.
Rick Thorpe, Suffragan Bishops 049. Thank you for calling me Chair. I welcome this report and all the amazing work that has been put into it. It's just astonishing. I think it was 1,000 connections and communications that you've had with people. And I welcome the move towards a greater simplification of the framework for pastoral reorganisation. This has been a long time coming, as you acknowledged, and I also want to affirm the emphasis on a more humanised approach based on good conversations which should underpin our processes. There is so much good here. Clearer consultative processes, trimming back on the multiplicity of orders and schemes, the abolition of the word suspension. I do, however, have a fairly major concern that the report largely focuses on the status quo. That is, it is more pastoral than mission in its orientation. There are many, many wonderful stories of revitalizations and new church plants around the country that have done really well. They've been done well in collaboration with parishes and their stakeholders. St Paul's Haringey in London was revitalized from a parish plant from Christchurch Mayfair. St George's Gateshead, that I was involved in supporting, revitalised with a team from St Thomas Sheffield. Or, of course, the fresh expression Lightwave that's mentioned in the report in Suffolk. Just amazing story after story that there are literally hundreds of stories that I could tell you just that have been started in the last few years. Freshly planted, growing, dynamic churches and new worshipping communities that are bringing new life to their parishes and to seeing new people coming to faith in Jesus. Synod now has more people than ever involved in this kind of work directly. But our legislation needs to enable the implementation of our vision and strategy for the 2020s. If we are, as we say we are, committed to a mixed ecology of church, then our legislative framework needs to reflect those priorities. And I'm concerned that those these proposals in their current form, are not necessarily going to help bishops make the changes needed to develop the mission and financial health of the church across the nation. The fundamental and financial challenges it faces after decades of decline. We are in a serious situation, and our mission and pastoral framework needs to help us address that. So a few comments on where this bites for me and for church planting colleagues. First of all, the requirement for dioceses to produce MPM frameworks could be a good thing, but could be constrained by the statutory guidance. And the time taken to adopt a framework in a diocese could hold up innovative planting and new worshipping community proposals. So the guidance needs to be light touch and flexible. Secondly, the fallow concept and the proposals for shared or temporary governance are a really good idea. But can we make space for parishes which need support to be able to grow lay-led communities, or to receive a plant, or to receive governance oversight from a resource church as part of these temporary arrangements? Thirdly, I welcome the simplified approach to the reuse of closed buildings. Bringing buildings back into use for planting purposes would be much easier under this set of proposals. I regret the approach that's taken towards bishops' mission orders, or a part of that approach. There's a lot of evidence that these represent a major growth area in the life of the national church. But in a mixed ecology church, to subject them to a statutory five-yearly review process, rather than the bishop and local diocesan mission and pastoral committee deciding frameworks, seems arbitrary and centralising. We don't, after all, impose five-yearly reviews on parishes. Perhaps we should. One final suggestion. Can I propose that the group tasked with drafting this legislation includes someone with the experience of the intricacies and challenges of the legalities of enabling BMOs and the proactive side of church planting to be part of that group, so that that perspective is included from the start? Chair, I don't want Synod to retreat from its mission. Candidly, you couldn't really tell from reading the report that the church has severe mission and financial challenges. I have a concern that the church will become inoperable in some parts of the country if it's prevented from making the changes needed to prevent its extinction, or more positively, to help it thrive. So I wish this revision process well, but let's make it a tool for the re-evangelization of England. Thank you.
James Pitkin on Zoom, followed by the lady standing here.
Thank you for calling me. I'm James Pitkin, Winchester 234. I'm not able to be with you in York because a pastoral scheme has just come into effect, with me becoming incumbent of 2 additional parishes, and this is my first week as their new vicar and rector. And I start with a declaration of interest. I've been a member of the General Synod Reference Group since its inception in May 2022. I also hosted a visit by the commissioners to Romsey Deanery in Winchester Diocese, which is reflected on page 32 in the report. Invited to that meeting during that visit were both clergy and laity. They had both experienced good and bad times with the current measure. We were listened to, and our experiences were reflected in this review. So thanks for that go to Flora Winfield, Wendy Matthews, and their team. I'm also a workplace representative of the Church of England Employees and Clergy Advocates, SECA, as well as being its vice chair. And in my time in that role as a workplace rep, I've seen that the current MPM has often been misapplied. It's often been experienced by parishes as a painful and sometimes bullying process. The process has often been misapplied by bishops and diocesan staff. Adopting this review will ease the experience of parishes and deaneries. It will also enable parishes to make helpful changes. It clarifies the processes and sometimes streamlines them. Individuals and parishes can offer opinions on any scheme, and the interested parties are involved in both orders and schemes. The new MPM, which I hope will emerge from this review, is one to be welcomed. More flexibility will be available, and yet the rights of the parish and its clergy are retained. I believe that this measure, this review, can be weighed in the balance and found not wanting. Thank you.
Thank you. After our next speaker, I'll have Jonathan Baird.
July, Gloucester Diocese 122. I have a number of declarations of interest. I'm chair of Gloucester DAC. I'm a member of the Church Buildings Council, and I am a team vicar in a group of 11 small rural parishes. I'm delighted with the work so far. Thank you. A new mission and pastoral measure that focuses on trust and on listening and on well-being and working in partnership sounds great. I recognise the current problem that the report speaks about when church buildings are seen in such a binary way. The current mission and pastoral measure doesn't recognise either the way that churches are a focus for small communities, especially if they have no shop, no pub, no other place to gather like a hall. These small communities can't sustain regular weekly worship, but really, really want to use their churches at Christmas. They are less than festival churches, but more than fallow churches. Village churches already share governance and mixed use arrangements. And although I love that phrase of churches being fallow for a time, I wonder who is going to pay for their upkeep, because the money has to come from somewhere, even to clear the gutters, let alone to put a new roof on. I also wonder whether the CBC is the place to look at those new uses. It's used like that now, but surely local knowledge is more important to how those buildings might be used. I would hesitate to say that even the DAC doesn't have the knowledge that the area dean, the parish themselves, the clergy, and maybe even the archdeacon have. So a simplified process for alternative uses for buildings sounds marvellous to me. I want to be able to return fallow churches to worship use and alternative use when somebody comes up with a bright idea. I'm excited about this renewed measure as a DAC chair and as a member of CBC, but I am especially excited as a rural priest. This is, or could be, simpler, humbler and bolder. Thank you.
After Jonathan Baird, I'm going to be calling on Mr. Ian Johnston to move the first of his amendment, item 79.
Jonathan Baird, Salisbury, 400. Thank you, Chair. There is one impressive thing about this report. It has rather attractive coloured photographs. In the public consultation on GS 2222, 1,600 people wrote in about its horrors. Such horrors continue to haunt us. This report fails to address them. The terms of reference have been far too prescriptive, and it has been driven through with unseemly haste. We members of the reference group have been unable to address two central matters. First, the nigh universal collapse of trust in the church. Second, the misuse and abuse of episcopal and diocesan power. There is nothing in this report to address the chronic imbalance of power and resources between bishop and parish. There is no defence against the parish being steamrollered. There is no way to stop the latest ill-advised scheme being forced through. Look at the wreckage of Truro, Leicester, and Winchester. This report is impressively underwhelming. There are too many platitudes. Much of it is difficult to understand. It is riddled with such statements as could include and consideration could be given. In the trade, these are known as double doubtfuls. They will do nothing to restore trust. The report does propose an iota of redress for parishes. However, it is too little and would come far too late. There are practically no mandatory powers or protections. In coping with pastoral reorganisation, there is a huge imbalance of knowledge and experience between diocese and parish. This needs to be put right. Parishes need early redress and fairness. They need legal support. They need to be granted stronger powers of self-determination. Otherwise, fragile parishes will wither and die. Let us fight to preserve parishes. Give them vicars. We have the money. Let us stop pulling down the shutters. This report is a charter of surrender. I urge you not to welcome it. In order to avoid the ecclesiastical nuclear winter of Wales, Scotland, and the Methodist Church, we need to go back to the drawing board with this time powerful and meaningful terms of reference. And any statutory guidance must form part of the draft legislation with full and rigorous scrutiny by this chamber. The MPC-PC could be most effective. Certainly, it has a dedicated and diligent staff. However, to be so, its apposite independence needs to be set in stone. It requires beefing up, and it needs to have early, robust, and invasive powers. To put all of this in secular terms, the roulette table requires the attention of a spirit level. If we were to welcome this report, we would be sounding the death knell for swathes of parishes. Please do not welcome it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I now call on Mr. Ian Johnston to speak to and move The first of his amendment, item 79. You have up to 5 minutes.
With respect, Chair, could I put 79 and 80 together because they are intimately linked?
You can speak to them both together, but you can only move the first item, 79.
Thank you.
And you'll have 5 minutes to speak to both.
Ian Johnson, 387, Portsmouth. For those of you who were here last night, you will notice I've left my computer at home. I have my speech. A declaration of interest, I'm a member also of the reference group, a group which I have to say has worked extraordinarily hard over the last 18 months. We are all painfully aware, as I said last night, of the trust deficit, and references to it during the Business Committee debate were not well received, and that is not an encouraging sign. We all know the causes of this trust, and indeed many of them have been mentioned already tonight. We all have an obligation to address them. It should be front and centre of everything we do. And I have to say I'm very proud of the governance review which has done just that. So the MPM should affect the parish in every way imaginable. Now if we look at the existing MPM, the MPM 2011, it says this: those using the measure will have regard to worship, mission and community as central to the life and work of the Church of England, and to the traditions, needs and characteristics of particular parishes, and it refers to pastoral supervision. So in updating the MPM, we must consider far more than just redundant churches and parochial boundary changes. And clearly, today's situation is screaming out for a more holistic attitude to be taken regardless, and we heard a lot of that from Mr. Baird. GS 2315 addresses some generally welcome but relatively minor issues. It is superficial. It actively avoids the matters that actually affect our parishes looking to the future. And this is a key point. It uses statute excessively while avoiding delegation and subsidiarity. And this is hardly a declaration of trust. It goes nowhere near the need for effective oversight. I have to say Turnbull didn't either, but that's no justification for it. It does not address the widespread power imbalances, again, that Mr. Baird has just referred to, and it avoids commenting on representation at all. GS 2315 disappoints because, as has been said, its restrictive terms of reference. The future well-being of our parish, in my view, is not being taken seriously by the church governors. Remember Candide. Pangloss encouraged a complacent attitude towards all that is wrong in the world because God created it in this way and so it was the best available. Well, Pangloss, well, governors, everything is not rosy in our world. But neither is it clear how Synod should respond to 2315. We have two options. Either we can redirect the work as my amendment proposes, and this is, I accept, a maximal approach, in which case we would need to consider at least a parishes commission. For those not aware of it, I'd be very happy to explain it to you. Enlightened diocesan managements that really do involve the parishes, and I'm delighted to say there are some around, but there are also an awful lot that aren't. Effective oversight. Not only is this critical in the governance review, it is absolutely essential also in the MPM, and a synod both willing and able to hold our diocese to account. I noticed the 11th notice paper has assessed the cost of my amendment, point one being between £1 and £2 million, and I'm under no illusions that the amendment that I'm proposing will not be cheap. But the second option we have is to stop it. Take the old MPM and make it better by updating the code of practice and encouraging everyone, and I mean everyone, to use it. This is a minimal approach. The problem, I suggest, with the old MPM, because you can ask people who have experience of it on the MPCPC, and they say generally, actually, it works quite well. The problem is the code of practice is not well understood, and it is not known by our parishes generally. Our senior management teams might be well aware of it, our parishes generally aren't, and that is a major weakness. So one thing we could do on this minimal approach is to take that old code of practice and really scrub it up. Give it a good new look at the future and offer it to all of our parishes and our senior management teams to use with the old MPM. This would be really quite a simple way forward. We heard from James Pitkin of the abuse of the MPM 2011. I suggest to you that it's not so much an abuse of the MPM, but more of its code of practice and the lack of knowledge of it. That's where the problem is. That is a fixable problem.
Can you move
I move
amendment?
the amendment in my name, number 79, on the basis that that is necessary in order to pause the work.
Thank you very much. I now call on the Reverend Flora Winfield to respond to Mr. Johnson.
Chair, I'd like to respond to both amendments at the same time. Thank you very much.
Sorry, the Reverend Flora is going to speak to both the amendments, as he has spoken to both, but we're only going to be voting on item 79, which is the one that he moved. We will move them separately and vote separately on it. And we go up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Ian, for your amendments and for your careful attention to these issues and your commitment to the General Synod Reference Group, which is much appreciated. We are going to resist both these amendments, and I will explain why in a moment. But before that, I want to say that we recognise the issues that you have raised, and we echo your concerns about trust and the relationship between parishes and dioceses. They came up strongly in our work, both with the General Synod Reference Group and in our wider consultation and engagement. However, the task the commissioners were set by the Archbishop's Council in 2020 was a legislative review, and it was appropriate for the commissioners to focus on recommendations in relation to our responsibilities, and not more widely, that is, to stick to our knitting. Synod overwhelmingly voted for this review work on the MPM in July 2021. Ian, I would just like to say that your assertion that the GS 2315 doesn't address consultational representation is slightly confusing, because Annex B transparently sets out an illustration of that representation and consultation. So it is there in the document, and we did discuss it quite fully in the reference group. As I hope members of Synod can see, we have placed trust at the heart of our approach to the recommendations about change in the mission and pastoral measure, which is why we have put such an emphasis on a cultural shift to a more pastoral and collaborative approach in GS 2315, and have deliberately proposed a new legal architecture which will help facilitate and enable that cultural change. That new legal architecture would increase transparency and accountability, critical elements to creating and building the better trust between parishes and dioceses that I know you want as much as we do. From a commissioner's perspective, there are many different ways in which we can actively seek, all of us, to build trust in the church. And we have worked to do that in the task of this review, which was entrusted to us, and would encourage others to follow in that path. So, Synod, I encourage you to move forward with an approach which will better facilitate our shared ministry and resist these amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. As the chair, as Flora has not accepted the amendment, doesn't support the amendment, it will lapse unless 25 members stand in their places or otherwise indicate that they wish the debate on the amendment to continue and a vote to be taken on the amendment. I therefore now invite members to stand in their places or, if unable to do so, otherwise indicate. For those on Zoom, please use the green ticks to indicate if you wish the debate on the amendment to continue. We do have 25 people standing, so the debate continues on the amendment. 79. On item 79. Lady here, thank you, and the gentleman there, thank you. You still have 5 minutes speech limit. Thank you.
Joyce Jones, Leeds 136. I would like to give a view of this from a parish point of view and to speak against the amendment. I welcome the review of this measure and the attempt to make it simpler and more pastoral in its application. And I speak from the point of view of a parish priest, where a parish did decide to petition for the closure of a church. And I would say that in our diocese, parishes have to agree and have to petition if they wish for a church building to be closed. It isn't initiated by the diocese, so I would recommend that to others as well. And my experience of that is not that it happens too fast, but it generally happens too slowly. I hear the suggestion of a fallow time to give them a parish to stabilise. I can see that might be right in some circumstances, but I would hope that this measure will give more flexibility and to recognise that there may be situations which are more straightforward and which the wishes of the parish are to get the job done so they can move on to develop their mission and their ministry in different ways. And I know of others who've had a similar experience. I was the vicar of a parish where one of the church buildings, which was 20th century and not listed, had a problem with a porch roof which was so unstable that the building couldn't be used. There were insufficient funds to repair it, it was difficult to get grants, there was no community use, and after much time exploring different options, the PCC petitioned for closure. Now, this was particularly unfortunate because it was January 2020. So before a survey could be done, the pandemic hit and everything stopped. Therefore, a year where nothing happened except the building was visibly deteriorating before everyone's eyes. Even when a video survey was eventually agreed to after a year and the process and things started again, the process still took a very long time. It's a difficult decision for a PCC to decide that a church building has to be closed, and in a case where everyone is in agreement, it prolongs the agony if it takes many months before the building can be handed over to the diocese and the PCC can be relieved of responsibility for it. And if the building can't be used, it's hard to have to continue with maintenance and maybe more expensive insurance and to try and keep it safe. And if worship is still taking place in the building, it's disheartening for a dwindling number of worshippers to have to continue over a long period of time. So I welcome the measure. I resist the amendment. I think that it will hopefully that it will give more flexibility to consider the wishes of parishes and adapt to them, and I hope it will provide that flexibility adapting to particular circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman here, and afterwards I shall be looking for a motion for closure.
Thank you, Chair. Andrew Orange, Winchester 430. Well, Synod, we've been going 20 months now in the current quinquennium, if I can say it. And this is quite a significant day. It is, I think, the first day that we have debated parish and the ministry of the Church of England in this way. And before dinner, we had a wonderful speech, a wonderful motion to revitalise the parish. But now we have a motion that will disempower it. It's rather like the paralysed man has taken up his bed to walk, but now we're clobbering him with a mallet. I'm afraid the paper before us is a flawed, half-baked document, and I think we should support the amendment and regroup the work. We can do that because the existing MPM has worked perfectly well over many years, and it can go on a bit more. I know the paper that we're considering only too well, having been on the reference group myself, where certainly everyone was sincere and trying their best. But I think Synod may be beginning to sense that there are certainly some members of the reference group who are not entirely happy with the way it's gone, and the outcome just doesn't seem to be good enough. The document boils down to 13 recommendations, all about process, and it's a document full of questions. Sadly, there is no overarching vision defining the direction of travel. And the sheer vagueness spawns concern that this motion is just another stepping stone on the path of diminishing parishes. And actually it's the same concern that caused 1,600 people to write in with objections to its forebear, GS 2222. So we'd better be careful. This document isn't going to rebuild that trust. So I think I should say just a few words about what overarching vision would one like to see. And I think you have to say the starting point should be the parish perspective. With churches throughout our nation, we have a God-given asset that we should cherish for ministry. And we should listen to what they say if we are serious about bringing Christ to all God's people, wherever they are. So we need a measure that gives empowerment and agency to those parishes so that they can be relevant to their communities, in nurturing Christian faith, certainly, and also in performing new, more modern roles in the wider secular community. And the diocese, for their part, should stop trying to control and instead give practical support for grassroots initiatives. Let the Holy Spirit get to work in 1,000 different ways, and we might be surprised. Let's remember that in the countryside, village parishioners think the church is theirs. As one wrote to me, the church was paid for and has been maintained by the community for 150 years. Actually, we, the community, have as much right, if not more, to claim the church as belonging to us. Above all, we need a motion that grants parishes proper rights and legal representation. And yes, which is in this document, the possibility of fallow status schemes and partnerships. So in conclusion, I ask Synod to celebrate the sense of local ownership,
to see it as the wonderful opportunity that it is, and to recognise that it is through nurturing it and empowering our own local parish communities that we will revitalise it for the future. So please vote for this amendment, because it does address the concerns I've expressed. Thank you.
I now wish to test the mind of the Synod on whether item 79 has been sufficiently debated. I therefore put the motion for closure on item 79. Those in favour of the motion for closure on Zoom, green ticks, and those in favour here in the hall, simple show of hands. Thank you. Those against? Clearly carried. So I now will put item 79 for the vote. Those in favour of item 79. If I see 25 members standing, then I will have a count. We do not have 25 members. Thank you.
Those in favour.
So those in favour, please show. Thank you. Those against? Thank you. That is clearly lapsed. Thank you.
Lost.
I'm going to ask Mr. Johnson once more if you could come and move item 80. And the chair is feeling a little bit generous, and so I'm going to ask you to complete your statements from where you left off.
Thank you, Chair. Trust has a funny way of manifesting itself sometimes. I very much appreciate it. You'll be pleased to know that I'm very nearly finished anyway. So, the work that we have done so far, and I know this more than anyone, I think, or as well as anyone, good though it might be in itself, and I accept there are some good points in 2315, is incomplete. And in particular, it does not look forward enough. It doesn't set the parish in the 21st century. It is a small increase on the old MP. It looks at the boundary changes and the church closures, but that is it. It does not look forward. Legislation based on 2315 would, in my view, be neither cost-effective nor, I would suggest, even effective in the use of resources. And the question is whether any further work on it is justified is completely moot. We do spend, do we spend some on questionable ends, some small amount, maybe, on questionable ends, finishing off 2315, but then what will we have at the end of it? Or a lot more on a grander plan. And it is, in my mind, far from clear how actually to take this forward. Going to legislation now, I think, would be a mistake, because we wouldn't have anything of substance different to what we had. Upgrading the code of practice on on NPM 2011, the code of practice would make a huge difference. And so I recommend that Synod pauses the updating of 2011. So please support the amendment in my name, and Chair, thank you very much indeed again for your discretion.
Can you formally
I'm sorry.
Move.
Yes, I'm not quite used to this yet. Please will you support the amendment in my name? Thank you.
It's item 80.
I beg your pardon?
You're formally moving item 80.
I do beg your pardon. I formally move the amendment in my name.
Can I invite the Reverend Flora Winfield to formally respond, having already spoken to it?
Madam Chair, I do so formally respond to item 80. And I urge Synod to resist this amendment. Thank you.
So as this is not supported, I need to see 25 members standing to indicate that they want the debate on item 80 to continue. There are 25 standing.
Is it now open for debate?
The item is now open for debate. May I call the lady here? Yes. Followed by the gentleman there. You still have 5 minutes.
Jane Palmer, Salisbury 213. I've been struck over the last few days with all of the discussions around trust. And it seems to me that lots of the language around power and mistrust seem to be coming not with the desire for a future of unity and truly shared power, but the relocation of power to another base with another agenda. I asked a friend yesterday if we are called to preserve the parish or to build a kingdom. Let's not be arrogant enough to believe we are the only builders out there. The parishes that I am blessed enough to serve are communities. They're not buildings, although we have several beautiful ones. More people do not attend our building or support our traditional structure, but we love our worship and our buildings, and people give up huge amounts of time and energy to serve it. But since I was appointed 4 years ago now, it's been hugely challenging to appoint lay officers. We're just about to finish becoming one legal parish, which frees us up from meetings for mission. We have energy to go to our local pub at Christmas and do a nativity, to share the gospel with people who will never come through our door. And we can't do that unless our processes become simpler, humbler and bolder. So I urge you, Synod, not to stop this work, because let's be honest, our parish system is not functioning in the way that it needs to for the future. If we want people to know the Lord, to make Jesus known, as we say in Salisbury, then we need to change things. And it's painful and it's hard, but the Lord will be with us. We pray a prayer in our benefice that we wrote, asking us to trust in God, even when the future seems uncertain. And you know, the Lord is providing for us. We paid our parish share in one of our parishes this year, the year just gone, even though we know that our regular giving covers just 50% of that share. And that share's about £30,000. Now, it doesn't mean we haven't got challenges, but we can do this because the Lord is on our side. And we cannot have a language or a system that talks about us. It has to talk about mission and the people that we are there to serve, and that is not ourselves. Thank you.
Our next speaker.
Chris Angus, 265, Carlisle.
and this isn't a planned speech. I think we have two things here. We have the recommendations for a measure to handle our mission and pastoral affairs, but we're also faced with clear breakdown of trust in many areas. I actually think that the work that's been done by the reference group, and particularly by the people who've been involved in drafting it, by Wendy and Flora, is a really good piece of work. But it can't solve all our problems. You can't legislate for trust. And it's clear that in some dioceses there is a breakdown of trust between the diocese, as we call it, but I guess in many cases that's possibly the bishop, and the parishes. It certainly doesn't happen everywhere. In Carlisle, we actually work well in partnership. The parishes, the deaneries, the diocese, and our bishop. It's a diocese in good state, in good heart. So we don't actually have some of these problems, and so we have to think why. And one is that we don't impose things from the centre on our parishes. If we're going to be closing churches, that closure actually only comes from the parish, and usually with some reluctance. And we don't close many churches, and quite often if the church closure process begins, we manage to reverse it at some point. So I think delaying work towards the new measure to do some work separately on trust will get us nowhere. I think we need to vote against this amendment, and we also, I think, will need to vote against Marcus's amendment, because those are things that we can take when we look at the legislation. So let's have some trust in the process. We have a superb starting point, so let's just get on with it. Thank you.
I now wish to test the mind of the Synod on whether item 80 has been sufficiently debated. I therefore put the motion for closure on item 80. Those in favour of the motion for closure on item 80, please show. Thank you. Those against? That is clearly carried. We now vote on item 80. Those in favour of item 80, please show. Thank you. Those against? Thank you. That is clearly lost. I would now like to call the Reverend Marcus Walker to move his amendment, item 81. You have up to 5 minutes.
Very much indeed, Madam Chair. And much more importantly, thank you, Flora and Wendy. This piece of work is, to my mind, excellent. There is so much that is so good about the work that is found in this review. There is much that could, if all the coulds that are in the report are turned into teeth at a later stage of legislation, actually really help to bring parishes and dioceses back together. I have found myself to have been profoundly entrusted, perhaps to use the word, I know entrusted is the wrong word, profoundly moved by the amount of trust that was built up in the conversations of the review group of which I was a part. I would really like to flag up some of the positives of this report. of the fallow spaces, the fallow time that we've heard about discussed, of the ability to bring in a sort of flying squad of people to be able to help a PCC with fabric questions when they don't have the expertise, or to support them financially, that might stop a parish getting to the point of closure or merger. I really think that the simplification and clarification of the powers of the bishop over the parish are really good. And if they're turned into real legislation with teeth, will help hugely in the rebuilding of trust. There were two areas in our conversations which, when we were talking, both Flora and Wendy would say, we feel that the remit given to us by the Synod before the last general election, before the last synodal election, and the Synod, and by the Archbishop's Council, meant that if they were to take them forward, they would need to test the mind of Synod. And that's what my amendment is here to do. Because I think that we are very close to an actual landing zone here, to use that phrase. There were two aspects that really came out of the huge response to the original review. When 1,600 people wrote in, the largest response to any measure proposed by the Synod. And that was that people were very concerned about a reduction in rights of representation and in rights of appeal to the Mission and Pastoral Committee of the Church Commissioners, and then on to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. And that people were very concerned about the actual equality of parishes when dealing with their dioceses. So that's what this amendment seeks to do, and seeks to test your mind. And they're very simple, and I don't think they should be very controversial. The first is just to establish the same line now, the same line in the future as exists now, in terms of representation and in terms of rights of appeal. It just says, let's not reduce them, let's just keep them as they are. And the second is perhaps the most important, because it is in fact something that builds on what's in the report itself, which on page 40 quotes the Bingham principles of the rule of law, that the law must be accessible to both sides. And at the moment there is a great disparity between the parish and the diocese. When the diocese is looking to consider a pastoral reorganisation or a closure, they have all the resources of the parish share to draw upon. The parish, which is already in a weak position if it's being considered for that, has nothing. So all I'm asking for is that we look at ways of equality, of access to justice, so that parishes can seek legal advice properly, and that we just leave the rights of representation and appeal where they are. And I'd love, on the back of that, to be able to support this review. I move the motion that stands in my name.
Thank you. I call on the Reverend Flora Winfield to respond. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Marcus, for your amendment and for your kind words, which I very much appreciate, and also for your commitment to the General Synod Reference Group and for your wholehearted participation in its work. I do this with a heavy heart because I think we are only separated on some of these questions by a matter of sequencing and timing and synodical process rather than matters of substance, although that's not true of both of them. So the Commissioners do want to resist this amendment. We think it would be best if Synod works together through draft legislation when a text is ready, with the usual processes of legislative scrutiny, to decide where the balance should lie on the specific details of the new measure, particularly in relation to rights of consultation and representation. As I said earlier, what the Commissioners have sought to do is to find the balance between the need to modernise, update and streamline the MPM processes, but at the same time to do so in such a way that the checks and balances within the MPM are maintained appropriately. We hope and expect that this balance will continue to be considered with real seriousness and care if and when the legislative process proceeds. So, in relation to the second point, the Commissioners agree that it is important that the decision-making processes are fair and should be accessible for all. However, as I said before, we do want to avoid the whole process becoming dominated by an adversarial approach. This is absolutely opposite of what we're trying to achieve in building agency and participation. And that's important because that kind of adversarial approach would not be the pastoral context, the missional context in which we hope the new measure will operate. Our proposals are, by design, intended to reduce the need for legal support. A simpler, clearer measure will make it less likely that legal support is needed. But we are grateful for this challenge, and we will reflect further as we work on more detailed proposals if Synod agrees that we should take this forward as part of the next stage of our work. So I ask you to resist this amendment. Thank you.
As the mover of the main motion does not support this amendment in item 81, it will lapse unless 25 members stand to indicate that they want the debate to continue on this amendment. We do have 25 members standing, so the debate continues on item 81. Sorry. Can we call on the prolocutor, followed by the gentleman standing there with the paper in his hand like that? They both have papers in them.
Luke Miller, 163 London. Thank you, Chair. Good fences make for good relationships, and I really welcome this review and all the work that's gone into it. The collaboration, the consultation has been, I think, exemplary, and as Marcus has just said, there is some fantastic stuff within it, and it seems to me that we should all be supporting it, however these amendments work through. I do think Marcus has a point here about the need for fairness of access to resources should things in fact come to that point. And I would like us to put a marker down that that really needs to be looked at very seriously indeed as the legislative process goes forward. Why? Because ultimately one of the things that builds trust is a framework of law. In a legally structured church, then law provides one of those places. And one of the things that law does is to provide a safe place for adversarial processes when agreement can't be found. And therefore, in that structure, everybody needs the levels of support which are required properly to be able to access those legal frameworks. Now, sometimes it might be that the boot is on the foot of the parish, if that's very wealthy, and the DBF isn't. Sometimes the parish may have access to somebody who's able to have legal aid, and the DBF, as a corporate entity, might not. But more normally, it would probably be that the parish would need some support. I think there would need to be built into this some way of ensuring that things can't just spiral through a whole series of appeals and counterclaims, as sometimes happens. And I know that in the Diocese of London we've occasionally had that experience when an outside and very well-funded party has been able to take many more steps than seemed sensible. And so the framework needs to be one in which there are good exit strategies well built in. The legislative process in detail can look at how those principles might be applied and formed. But it seems to me that these things are needed. Too often we've had things go on too long. I'm sure that both the Chair and the Second Estates Church Commissioner will be delighted to know that I'm looking forward to an induction in September at a church of which they have both been priest in charge and which has not had an induction since the 1950s, because following a very long incumbency there's been a rather, for some good reasons and some less good reasons, slightly over long period of what we're no longer going to be calling suspension. We need to address these issues for the benefit of the whole church, for its mission and growth, for its mixed ecology, and for all that we try to do to proclaim the gospel. But we do that within a framework of law and a framework of trust, which will be helped if we can enable equal and fair access at each level and in each way, but with clear limits to stop us going down rabbit holes that are not necessary. I hope very much that you will support this amendment in order to put a marker down for those who will take the detailed work forward.
I'm now going to reduce the speech limit to 3 minutes. After Mr. Benfield, I'm going online to Debbie McIsaac.
Paul Benfield, Blackburn, 66. Following on from what the prolocutor has said, Madam Chair, you may know that I'm a former diocesan registrar and I still have a practicing certificate as a barrister. I am quite often consulted by parishes and church wardens about issues going on. Sometimes it's just explaining the process of the pastoral measure as it now exists, but sometimes it is more serious. Now, generally, I give that advice pro bono, without charge, but if you're a wealthy parish and you want my advice, please do come to me. Because some of you will know my wife, and she needs to be kept in hats.
Debbie McIsaac on Zoom, after which I shall be testing the mind of Synod for closure on this item 81. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you for calling me, Chair. Debbie McIsaac, Salisbury 402. I very much hope that Synod will support both parts of this amendment. I think it is important that people know that they can get the kind of help that they need when they feel that their rights and entitlements are at risk, or when they just get confused. I belong to a group of churches in Salisbury Diocese. Some of them are really quite small, and they struggle. And this is exactly the sort of support and confidence that will give them confidence that what is happening is fair and being dealt with to advantage all parties concerned. At the end of the day, there are legal rights and entitlements and processes to be followed. I don't think we should be afraid of that sort of reconciliation being found sometimes through legal processes. I think the improvement is great, but I think that Father Walker's amendments enhance the position and will make it very palatable to both parishes and to dioceses and to churches and to the national church. Thank you.
Thank you. I now wish to test the mind of the Synod on whether item 81 has been sufficiently debated. I therefore put the motion for closure on item 81. Those in favor, please show. Thank you. Those against? That is clearly carried. We now vote on item... Do I see 25 members standing for a vote for the whole synod? No, I do not. Thank you. I now put the item 81 to the vote. Those in favour, please show. Thank you. Those against? It is lost. So we now return to the main motion, item 28, and the debate continues. 3 minutes. Mr. Timothy Good and the Bishop of Norwich.
Tim Good, Southwark 224. Thank you, Chair, for calling me. And I wish to declare an interest. I'm a trustee of the Church's Conservation Trust. And I would like to focus in particular on this new idea of the fallow concept, and especially at the Commissioner's desire to explore options to avoid prematurely closing churches when a fragile church could have been saved if there had been some safety nets to help the parishes in need. The Church's Conservation Trust would welcome the opportunity to be such a safety net, supporting historically important churches that are presently in active use, trying to prevent their closure and avoid the possibility of them then being vested with the Church's Conservation Trust. For over 50 years, the Church's Conservation Trust has been looking after historic Grade 1 and 2-star churches and supporting communities to keep them in use. We would be pleased to bring this experience to bear, subject, of course, to being provided with the resources and funding to do so, in support of keeping churches open, alive, and in continued use, liberating then PCCs to focus on what so many PCCs wish to do, which is engage in the ministry and mission of their church and build up the body of Christ. The CCT has the specialist staff in conservation, maintenance, interpretation, and community building, a breadth of knowledge and experience that could prove invaluable for PCCs struggling with the challenges of maintaining Grade 1 and Grade 2-star listed buildings, often without the expertise to deal with leaking roofs or rising damp. But the CCT also recognises that there are many others working towards the same aims, and that we alone are not of the scale to assist all those who may require it. And the CCT, therefore, would, however, welcome the opportunity to work alongside friends and partners with similar aims, working together in support of churches that are vulnerable or fallow. Thank you.
Bishop of Norwich, after which I will be testing the mind of Synod for closure.
Graham Usher, Norwich 029. Thank you for calling me Chair. And I declare an interest as a diocesan bishop and as a church commissioner who is a member of the Mission, Pastoral and Church Property Committee. So I have seen firsthand the current measure in action and worked with its processes both in the diocese I serve and my role on committee. Whilst there is much that does work well in the current measure, there is undoubtedly room for improvement. And I support the recommendation to replace the existing measure with this new legislation and the other recommendations which flow from that. And I do want to pay tribute to the very careful way that Flora Winfield, Wendy Matthews and the whole team have given to this work, listening, consulting and creating a wide tent of support. To use one of Flora's words, you've been quite splendiferous. I support the emphasis on a more pastoral approach and methodology, which puts the emphasis on partnership and collaborative working. When I've sat in hearings, I've often felt that it is this pastoral approach that somewhere has been lacking. We need to have those conversations, but we need to do them better. In Norwich, we delight in 658 church buildings. I'm slowly getting my way around them. 95% of them are listed, but each of them is a treasure trove of memory. Their architecture creating the beauty of holiness, locations of God's mini miracles, and places of answered prayer. Many, of course, were built so that their benefactors could get years off purgatory. The problem is we're still keeping them out of purgatory. But some in tiny, tiny hamlets now have no local support, or they've been left stranded in fields as the population has moved. And I am getting local parishioners asking for some solutions for these problems. What we have established in the diocese under my predecessor is the Diocesan Churches Trust, which allows some of these buildings into a season of hibernation. And I pray desperately that that season will not last long and the winds of the Holy Spirit will blow on the embers of the faith in that place. But any change in the measure needs to work for parishes, for patrons, and for dioceses. And I can see immense benefits from the report that has been brought to us. And so I wholeheartedly commend the motion to Synod. Thank you.
Thank you. I now wish to test the mind of the Synod on whether item 28 has been sufficiently debated. I therefore put the motion for closure on item 28. Those in favour, please show. Thank you. Those against? Thank you, that is clearly carried. I now call on the Reverend Flora Winfield to respond. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I know that both you and I rejoice with the Archdeacon of London at the great news that the church where we were both privileged to be priest in charge will shortly have a new priest in charge in the person of Bishop David Urquhart and a new incumbent. Thank you, Synod, for your stamina and for your resilience this evening and for all your thoughts and comments, which we will take away, clearly thinking through everything that you have said and reflect and consider further. This has been a very rich conversation this evening. Jane from Salisbury, I especially treasure your phrase, we cannot have a language with it which is about us, it must be a language about mission. I really appreciated hearing the stories about where the measure has worked well, where dioceses and parishes are working well together and in the way that the measure envisages. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Dana. Through our experience of the long consultation process, we know that there are many places where the mission has not worked well, where the measure has not worked well. And we hear also those voices which are critical of the way that we have undertaken our task. But we have done this work sincerely, and we have tried to do it with integrity and authenticity to the task that we were asked to undertake by the Archbishop's Council, and in a genuine spirit of waiting on the Spirit in those conversations and consultations which we have undertaken. We would argue that there is a clear vision for this work, and it's in the general duty of the measure, which is our shared outcome, is to further the mission of the Church and make better provision for the cure of souls. We are grateful to all those who have expressed support for this work. But we also hear the concerns, and if Synod approves this motion, We will continue to seek consensus as we progress this work together. Before I conclude, I want to express my own heartfelt thanks to the whole staff team who have undertaken this work at the same time as continuing to carry the enormous caseload represented by the work of the Mission and Pastoral Committee. Wendy in particular has worked in the most untiring and self-offering manner with absolutely unending reservoirs of professionalism and grace. Thank you. So, dear friends, I hope you will support the recommendations the commissioners have made. Our parishes are part of the unique geography, both physical and spiritual, of this country. And our church buildings continue to be a sacramental sign of God's presence and of the commitment to be a Christian presence in every community. We have been acutely conscious of this precious inheritance and of the particular challenges of our present context. And we have developed consensus through conversations which have been hopeful and realistic in proposing this renewed framework to support the mission and the cure of souls. I move the motion in my name. Thank you.
I now put item 28 unamended to the vote. If you're on Zoom, green ticks in favor or red crosses against. We will have a simple show of hands. Those in favor of item 28, please show. Thank you. Those against? Thank you. That is clearly carried. I now call on the Archbishop of York, who will dismiss us with his blessing.
Again, if you're able, please stand. And if you can bear it at the end of the day, a prayer for the evening before the blessing. O Lord, support us all the day long of this troublous life, until the shades lengthen and the evening comes, and the busy world is hushed, and the fever of life is over, and our work is done. Then, Lord, in thy mercy, grant us safe lodging, a holy rest, and peace at the last. And may the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be among you and remain with you.